people who aren't here. Oh, one and later. All right, perfect. Well, thank you for having me here. It's exciting to kick this off. And as Cindy said, I'm also here as a resource for you. It's a daunting task in a way to give you an introduction to policy, but hopefully this will be a good overview, and we'll talk about the legislative branch too. So Cindy said, I completed my fellowship with Federation of American Scientists recently. I have my own consulting firm, and I'm also an advisor for SPARC and other things. So I'm happy to connect with you on LinkedIn or Twitter. Contact is here, easy to find, but obviously I'm also in Slack, so feel free to reach out. So I'm going to also talk to you a little bit about my background, just so you know who we are. So I have my academic training is in biological biomedical sciences from Clemson, and my PhD from Emory. I was sort of in the biomedical space all these years. During this time, I got interested in academic reforms and how we can think about institutional change to support the future of science, whether that's with funding or mental health, postdoc pay, which is a big project we worked on for a few years. So I worked with a nonprofit called Future of Research. We did research on postdocs and advocated for change, wrote a few papers, tried to get institutions to increase salaries, and some of them did. So that was sort of my first exposure to advocacy. And then I moved to DC and transitioned over to actually being a fellow with Society for Neuroscience. Happy to talk about that. But this was really instrumental in working with Capitol Hill, organizing the Hill Day, reading the federal budget, and many other things that we did to connect members of SFN to Capitol Hill. After that, I worked with the University of California, federal relations, for almost 4 years, also on scientific research policy, similarly connecting researchers in the UC system to the Hill, advocating for research funding and their perspectives. We had faculty and trainees participate. A lot of that was during COVID time. So Hill staff appreciated hearing from students who are going through that and supporting their research. So it was a really great role, and we have 2 examples here of doing this at a society and a universities. I'm happy to talk more about this in the future if you'd like. And currently doing consulting work with Sigma Xi and FAS and other organizations as well. So this is just my journey so far. So stay tuned for more. But a lot of my roles have been, and I think will continue to be, related to Capitol Hill. And so I think hopefully I'll give you a good overview of what it's like to do that as part of this lecture. So since this is the first time you'll hear about science policy, some of you probably know more, but sort of level the playing field here. I wanted to start with the basics and define science policy from this book. So Beyond Sputnik, I'll show you a few resources and books that I'd recommend that are sort of classics in the field. So this book, they define science policy as the set of federal rules, regulations, methods, practices, guidelines, under which scientific research is conducted. So it's very general. Science and policy are interconnected, as you can see here, influence each other. So be thinking about that as you're working on your assignments. These are 2 fundamental concepts, science for policy, which is probably what a lot of you think about, depending on which way you work on this. But basically, science for policy is how we can use scientific findings to develop public policy. And the other side is policy for science, which is how do we think about government laws, regulations, and policies that affect the practice of science. And so we'll talk more about science for policy today, thinking about evidence-based decision-making as you're going to work on your different assignments and topics. But keep in mind that these are 2 facets of the same coin in some ways. So science policy, there's a whole science behind it. This is another book. That's a good resource. So there's a lot of research going on around federal funded science, why we need to support research and how that relates to the federal government. That's, of course, going to influence our competitiveness as a nation, economic growth, well-being. As you probably know, a lot of policymakers don't have backgrounds in science, but they want this expertise. So you all are here to learn that and to bridge the gap. And historically, so I'll tell you a bit of history too, capacity, analytical capacity in science policy hasn't been as developed as other fields. There is a community of practice emerging around advancing the scientific basis of science policy. So it's a whole field, pretty fascinating. Of course, there's some grants that fund science policy work specifically, but I think in some ways it's still a nascent discipline as itself instead of studying the field. Historically, a few aims of science, sort of the science of science policy, have been to develop evidentiary basis for decision making for policy practitioners, people who are doing research and practice. Building a community between policymakers and researchers, to what Cindy showed you, how do these connect to each other? And also connecting both the origins and the later trajectories of social systems that provide guidance to policymakers. There's a lot on the economics of science policy and how these investments contribute to innovation in this country. So a lot to think about, but it's an interesting framing. More recently, of course, there's been more talk about using scientific approaches to inform policymakers, and this is what a lot of these programs do, and how we can think about influencing decisions that are evidence-based, where policy choices need to be made based on science, including the sequence of those decisions, as we'll talk about. So this conjunction is called the Science Policy Interface. And a bit of history here. So ways that science has been engaged with the government to support government decision-making has evolved a lot over the last 80 years. This involves translating essentially two different languages of scientists and policymakers and aligning the needs with outputs. So of course, scientists can provide advice, valuable advice to policymakers, and thinking about the views of one or the other side. There are a lot of factors that influence how policymakers choose science to make decisions. So before World War II, science was actually rarely in contact with policymaking and the political process. Policymaking was generally understood to be act in pursuit of the common good, which is still true, to serve the public interest. And of course, you want to, a lot of policymakers obviously want to serve constituents that they represent and that they serve in Congress. So the way that this happens or has happened traditionally is through science advice mechanisms, which is a whole other area. How science advice to government happens and how they communicate with the public is important, thinking about, again, evidence-based policy and how that connection between research and policy happens. And of course, we know what we hope that scientific evidence influences policy. It's not always clear how that knowledge actually enters the policymaking process. So we'll talk about that a little bit today. And there are a lot of mechanisms, what structures exist that influence policymaking. So it's dynamic. There are many different types of input that come into this, and we can think about how we can strengthen the science to policy interface through a lot of different frameworks that include assessing gaps, developing programs, developing capacity, and also different other tools that will support the policymaking process, which is complicated and also really interesting. So to the question of science advice, this is sort of where it all started. So Vannevar Bush was actually, well, he was an engineer, American engineer. Throughout his career, he emphasized the importance of scientific research to national security and economic well-being. And in 1945, he wrote this text, Science, the Endless Frontier, which you've probably seen. It was commissioned by President Franklin Roosevelt and called for a centralized approach to government-sponsored science. The proposals that he wrote eventually led to the formation of the National Science Foundation in 1950. And Vannevar Bush was, in essence, the first presidential science advisor. So I think it's really interesting. This is one of the quotes that he has in the book about how science can be effective as a team. Scientific progress is the only way to really move our country forward, essentially. So fascinating text. Would recommend reading this, but it's also an interesting bit of history and how this all started. So conceptually, again, a little more about the science to policy interface. There are 4 different ways this can happen and engagement happens. So another book for you, The Honest Broker. So in this book, Roger Pelkey describes 4 categories of how scientists can engage with policy. So it's really interesting that there's different ways to do this. One is the issue advocate, which we'll talk about today. So there is a distinction between the issue advocate and the honest broker, which is more balanced. The issue advocate provides evidence synthesis with a specific agenda or programmatic outcome. So you want to achieve something, you want somebody to do something about the particular issue. The honest broker, in contrast, is unbiased, provides evidence existing for policymakers on both sides, so they can make decisions based on pros and cons and different options presented. The science arbiter has a narrow focus, and some questions that science can answer doesn't really always try to influence the direction of policy, sort of watching what's going on. You can sort of look at both sides. And then pure scientists don't engage with policy. So people that are in science that are not interested could provide expertise. Not everyone does, but their research is used by policymakers to influence what they're doing. So keeping in mind the issue advocate, I'm going to ask you to think about an issue that you want to work on, since this is an advocacy course. Something that you want to change, that you want to advocate for, as a little bit of a break here. So I want to ask you to put something in the chat. So to get you to start thinking about what policy issue you want to advocate on. So for me, in my background, the topic for me would be broadly around the STEM workforce. The issue within this topic is postdoc salaries are low. The recommendation will be to do something about this. So we'll talk about that in a few minutes, but I'll stop for a second. And please type in the chat something that you'd want to advocate on. Maybe we'll take a couple of minutes. Actually, I think I need to stop this because I can't see the chat. Education, health, plastic pollution, good. Okay, so we have health, education, science, publishing, education, good. Okay, so there's some common themes here. Environment, climate change, very good. Okay, well, these are all things that Congress deals with. So as we'll talk about, thinking about where to go and who to talk to on your issue. So perfect. Thank you. All right, we'll move on. So to accomplish what you just wrote, or to address the issue that you wrote about, there are complicated mechanisms of how policy is actually made. So, as I said, the goal of good policy should be to improve the overall welfare of society. Science policy, though, is the product of a lot of mechanisms, different inputs coming in, mechanisms of how it works and interactions, as I'll show you. And it involves a lot of different entities, executive agencies, congressional committees, etc. And can occur through a lot of mechanisms, legislative, programs, and so on. And implementation happens at different levels, like the budget process is an example, and interpreting policies can also impact how people see the issues and who the audience is. So this is a quote by John Kingdon, also another famous person in the field, who says that essentially public policy is complex. Each of the areas is complicated itself, and it's dynamic, fluid, and loosely joined. So I'll show you what that means in a second. Public policy is very collaborative. It builds and works through collective decisions. So it's important to understand when a communal action makes sense. It involves consensus building, which can be difficult at times, but decisions are often made with limited resources, imperfect information, especially in Congress. Consensus building is really the way that a lot of decisions are made. Science policy is also pluralist in nature, has a lot of different facets, supported by multiple agencies and overseen by multiple committees. This is, again, Beyond Sputnik, the classic book, which this is the only place I've really seen all these players together. So I think it's a good visualization of how things work. But essentially, there's the Science Policy Web. The center of the web are key White House offices, such as OSCP and OMB, federal agencies, congressional committees, and subcommittees, and also scientific societies. Represented here, university associations, NGOs like national academies, and so on. The press, you can see around, or the media, connects these groups to the groups in the periphery. These are universities, industry, national labs, scientific societies, state and local governments, and the general public, all of which have an interest in science policy. And you can sort of imagine all the things coming into this middle part of the hub. And the groups in the center then are constantly influenced by interactions with those in the outer web. So it's back and forth, which you can sort of get an idea of why this is so complicated. So in this vein, thinking about how all these things come together, we come to talk more about the three branches of government. So Congress, legislative branch, is where laws are made. So you have Congress, which is House, Representative, and Senate. It goes to the executive branch, president, vice president, cabinet, where the laws are carried out. And the judicial branch evaluates the laws. This is where the Supreme Court and other federal courts are. So the bills will circulate between these branches back and forth. And again, it's a complicated process. A few mechanisms, and this is just, you don't have to know this, but just to give you an idea of what's going on at each level. So again, there's a lot going on at each of these branches, and you can sort of see how they work together on legislation, as we'll talk about that. But just to get an idea of how complicated this all is, and understanding how the process works is important. So in a specific, to bring this back home sort of to a specific problem that you wrote about, there are some steps to think about ways to actually make policy and who to go to. Just simplistically, this is a framework to starting with identifying a social goal, a problem that you want to solve. Think about what is the social benefit and how we can achieve that through effective public action. Diagnose the problem. So the question here is, what behavior has to change to achieve that goal. Identifying the appropriate institution for action. So who has the authority to act? Is it Congress? Is it an agency? Is it a subcommittee? Even you could go down to a specific level depending on who you think should act on your issue. And then you could create policy options, pros and cons. If you're advocating for one issue, one side of it, it's important to know the other side too. But it's a good practice and exercise to think about policy options for each of the issues that you're working on or you want to push, even if you want to push one of them. And then who is going to implement it? How will it be enforced? How will the policy changes be monitored? So there's a lot of practical things when it comes to the policy options that you pick, and we'll teach you those things. But this is sort of a good framework of how to think about an issue, and then you can pick a policy side to push for. So with that in mind, I'm gonna stop again and think about the issues that you're in the chat. What are potential solutions? So first of all, what is the consequence of not solving the problem? And then who should take an action? And this is not, I want you to think about that today and put something in the chat for this, but this is an ongoing question. So going through my example here, STEM workforce. Within the STEM workforce, the problem is that postdocs aren't getting paid enough. The consequence of that is that it's driving away talent from science. If I would advocate for change, I would write a letter to the NIH director. So that's the audience. The ask, for example, again, very high level would be to develop some sort of new program in NIH to fund them better. And the vehicle would be grants, right? So the audience for your issue could be a member of Congress, could be your local representative, could be a committee. The ask could be funding, could be a program to be created, could be to continue funding a program that already exists. Could be a grant, or legislative language is another vehicle to make change and go to your representative and say, I want to add this language to this bill, which is going to create this program. So vehicles are different. This is a simple example, but I think illustrates just ways to think about this issue. So again, I'll pause for a minute and get you to write in the chat about the solution for this, or what you would like your audience to do. So if you can put in who's your audience and what would you want them to do about the problem? Okay, it says create tools for parents and okay. Require training. NSF. Yeah, so that's good. So some of these are more specific. I like that you had a specific agency in mind. City officials, good. So you can see also different scales of impact here and who could be targeted. Perfect. Well, this will help you, I think, as you develop your pitch and OPED and everything, and your pitch for the competition, to think about who you want to talk to and why, and get you thinking through this process. So no need to have all the answers now. We'll keep going. So to think more about this, in terms of being effective in policymaking, there are a few questions you want to ask yourself. And I wanted you to think about this before I gave you the slide, but you can go back to this after. So the idea is that thinking about the context where the policy is being developed is important. You want to also be in the context of the current political landscape and how things can be moving or which things are more likely. And also practical aspects that relate to the implementation and monitoring. So one question, what is the existing landscape? What policy or what need does this policy fill? So for example, is there already a bill on this? Can I write a new one? Has somebody already worked on this before? Do I have new goals? What do you want to accomplish with this, but also make sure that no one's done it before? What are potential outcomes, advantages and disadvantages? So this is thinking about your audience. How is it going to impact your constituents, for example? If you're a legislator, how will they think about that? And that's what they'll think about. If I solve this problem, how are my constituents going to react? Who's impacted by this policy? Who will benefit and who will not? On the implementation side, these are just practical things to think about, because when you hire staff, for example, if you say, I want to create a new program at NSF to improve mental health, right? Then somebody has to monitor that this is happening. This program is created, which is likely from legislation. It will be enforced somehow through legislation for NSF to create it. You'll have a program manager to do it. So who will manage it? How much time and effort will it take? And then what is the long-term impact on stakeholders? So again, how much money is this going to be? Where do we get the money to do it if it's a new program? How is it going to impact scientists or whoever it's serving in a good or bad way? So practical things to think about. So think about your issue with this in mind, and that'll help you with policy formulation as we move forward in the program. So now I'm going to spend the last little bit here talking about the legislative process. Again, wanted you to understand more about federal policy in general, but the legislative process itself is complicated. So we'll share some of these resources, but in a high level, looking at this at a high level, it all starts with an idea, right? An idea develops into a bill. The bill is introduced by a member of the Senate or the House. It's assigned to a committee for review. The committee then meets to discuss, amend, and vote on the bill. If it goes forward, it goes to the full Senate or the full House. There will be more amendments, discussions, and voting. We'll get a little deeper into this, but then essentially both sides of the chamber need to agree. If they don't, and often there's a conference committee that where members of both chambers participate and try to resolve differences between the different versions of the bill, or try to even add amendments. This is where it can take a while to get a final version to send to the president. Once both chambers vote, the president can sign the bill into a law, which is what happened with the CHIPS Act, or he can veto it, he or she can veto it, and it goes back to Congress. It can be overridden by Congress. This is complicated at this step, so I don't have to go into everything here, but the president ultimately makes a decision, but there's a lot riding into this, and a lot of bills don't go all the way. Often bills get attached to other bills to make it more likely to pass. That's a whole other thing. So here's a little bit more about the process. I don't want to overwhelm you, but just to give you an idea that this is complicated, and this is pretty standard of how it works, but there are some places where you can plug into it also. So what happens is, so as I said, any member of Congress from the House or Senate can draft a bill. This can also come from advocacy groups or everyday citizens. You can suggest a bill to your member of Congress. The primary Congress member who's supporting the bill is a sponsor. The other members are co-sponsors. Once the bill is drafted, it's introduced. It'll be on congress.gov. And that's where obviously a lot of federal legislation is. So I'll show you an example, but that's something to consider. Of course, if you have somebody in the House who's a sponsor, it'll be introduced in the House. If it's sponsored by a senator, it's introduced in the Senate. Then it goes to the committee where, again, this is complicated. You'll have members of Congress who are interested in specific topics. The committee will examine it carefully. They may choose to hold hearings to talk more about the implications of the bill. This is where you can also have input from other stakeholders. So hearings, as you've probably seen on TV, allows other stakeholders to have an input from the executive branch or experts who want to testify, other public officials. You can oppose the bill, you can testify and oppose it. And it can basically die in committee, right? That's one option. Hearings are where this is sort of the first formal action of the committee. And again, all these different groups give input, and that could be the end potentially. So if it goes forward, in some cases it goes to subcommittees that are under committees. So again, we won't go into all that today, but it's a specialized section of the committee. For example, House Science has a research section and so on. There's a lot of committees and subcommittees that sometimes it goes back there because they can evaluate it better. So subcommittees can have their own hearings, subcommittees can make changes, and it can go back to a full committee for evaluation again. Subcommittees then mark up the bill. So markups are another way to have an input. This is where changes and amendments happen before the bill goes to the floor. This is, again, the committee can vote to not send the bill forward to the floor. The bill can die here. So it's another split. It's another option. If it goes to the floor, it's called ordering a bill to be reported. So again, not a lot of them get to that place, but again, markups are a place where changes can happen. This is where it'll go to the floor from here, but again, can stop here too. So once on the floor, we're on to number 6. There is additional debate here, and the full chamber votes. All the amendments are voted on. The bill is passed, assuming everything looks good, and could potentially go to another chamber. No, that's not what I meant. So if it's passed in the Senate, if it's passed in the House, it goes to the Senate and vice versa. So both chambers have to agree. Like I said, the conference committees where debates can still happen on amendments and the final bill text. Any differences will be reconciled here, and the bill can also die here if they can agree. If they agree, there'll be a report with recommendations for the final bill for the president to sign, and both chambers have to approve it, as I showed you before. And then finally goes to the president. So this assumes that both House and Senate approved a bill that's an identical form. They agree on the final text. It's approved on both sides. The president can sign into a law if he agrees. If he doesn't take action for 10 days, it becomes a law. I don't know if that's happened before. If the president is opposed, it's vetoed. And there's other things going on here that can happen. So assuming it's goes into a law, that's the end. If it's not, then Congress can override the veto as well. And it's a lot more complicated at this point too. But assuming it becomes a law, you can see how many steps are needed to get to that point. So with that in mind, I know we're close to time, but this is sort of where the rubber meets the road in some ways. So I had the opportunity to contribute to a Chips and Science Act, which was signed into law, which is a big deal because of everything I showed you and what a bill goes through to go to the end. So when I was with the University of California, we contributed an amendment, which again, you know where that happens now, on postdoc salary, so postdoc pay, which, as you can see what it looks like in the left here, essentially introduced postdocs into the bill because they were not in the bill, saying that all the sections where grad students were highlighted, postdocs were also included. And they also approved a 10% supplemental funding to support professional development for postdocs, which is not very common because a lot of bills deal with funding for research and not the training side. And the postdocs, I think, it's a growing area. But anyway, that was a joint effort working with Representative Lofgren and the House Science Committee to get to that point, and it became a law. Now, there is an interesting article from Statecraft, which is a good thing to subscribe to, by the way. They have a lot of interesting articles on political issues and policy drafting and how things move. So they interviewed Jerry Petrella, who was the aide to Senator Majority Chuck Schumer, who is one of the authors of the CHIPS Act. And there's an interview with him about how it all happened, which is fascinating. We'll definitely read that. But just for background, the bill became a law in 2022, authorizes $280 billion in quantum computing, clean energy, NASA, semiconductor manufacturing, and it's a broad bill, covers a lot of research areas and also graduate and postdoc training. But interestingly, and this is again how a lot of this happens. So the way it came about is by a combination of two Senate bills that were bipartisan, Endless Frontier Act and the United States Innovation Competition Act, USICA. There was a complicated negotiation. Both chambers of Congress were involved. The conference, again, which you know what that means now, and some pieces of this bills got attached to what eventually became CHIPS. So there's a complicated journey of this bill in Congress with bits and pieces attached from different other bills. So fascinating story. So finally, so now that you know all this, and I'll just give you this example of the Researcher Act here. But what I wanted to encourage you to do, especially as we'll move into the GovTrack session next week, look up bills you're interested in congress.gov. Hearings and markups, again, are places you can plug into. You can see what's going on. Most of them are on YouTube. And be current on the issues that you're interested in, see what Congress is doing. I think these bills can be a useful resource for you as you're thinking about writing and pitching and what actions you might want to take. So one option is to urge your congressperson to sponsor the bill, that sort of thing, or sign on to something that'll move it forward, because you can see how complicated this is. So the Researcher Act, again, is relevant to me and my interest in the postdoc issues, but this is currently in Congress. It was introduced recently and requires OSTP to develop policies for federal agencies to address financial instability of grad researchers and postdocs, and for other purposes, was introduced by Jennifer McClellan. And it's something you can follow. So I wanted to just stop sharing for a second and show you this before we adjourn here. Let's see if we can do this. So only because I think it's a good example of something that's moving now, and you can follow everything if you're not familiar with congress.gov. So HR 4002, this is what it is. You can see it's sponsored by Jennifer McClelland was introduced 6/12/23. It's in the referred to the House Committee on Science. Last action was referred to committee, so it's been introduced. Again, this is going to track all the stages here. When it passes the House and Senate, when it goes to President, it becomes a law. The text is here, all the background. Again, congress.gov is a good resource, so you can see. We won't go through this now, but you can read it here. It tells you what it is, who introduced it, what committee it was referred to, what actions were taken so far, which is nothing, introduced in the House 6/12. And then here are all the co-sponsors. And you can see this has grown over time, right? For 6/12 until February 7th. So this will keep adding here. It tells you what states and then committees refer to House Science. So this is something you can follow. Just thought it was a good example to show something that's going on and is in Congress now, but it's a good place to follow what's going on through this website. Joe.